In the history of the United Kingdom, the Victorian era was the period of Queen Victoria's reign, from 1837 until her death on 1901. In terms of moral sensibilities and political reforms, this period began with the Reform Act 1832. There was a strong religious drive for higher moral standards, led by the nonconformist churches such as the Methodist and the Evangelical wing established on the Church of England. Britain embarked on global imperial expansion, particularly in Asia and Africa, which made the British Empire the largest in history.
Ideologically, the Victorian era witnessed resistance to the rationalism that defined the Georgian period, and an increasing turn towards romanticism and even mysticism, with regard to religion, social values, and arts. Domestically, the political agenda was increasingly liberal, with a number of shifts in the direction of gradual political reform, social reform, and the widening of the franchise. The centrality of the family was a dominant feature for all classes, whereas repeatedly dictate traits that have to be dealt with: working wives, overpaid jokes, harsh factory conditions, bad housing, poor sanitation, excessive thinking, and religious decline. The era saw a reforms and renaissance of public schools inspired by Thomas Arnold at Rugby. The public school became a model for gentlemen and public service.
Historians have characterized the mid-Victorian era from 1850 to 1870 as Britain's golden years. There was prosperity, as the national income per person grew by half. Much of this prosperity was due to the increasing industrialization, especially in the textiles and the machinery. Also, the exports increased and the buildings, the constructions of railways in independent nations as India contributed to this prosperity. 19th century Britain saw a huge population increase accompanied by rapid industrialization stimulated by the Industrial Revolution. This stimulation of the Industrial Revolution caused that the wage rates improve steadily.
The early Victorian era, before the reforms of the 1840s, became notorious for the employment of young children in factories and mines, and as chimney sweeps. Child labor played an important role in the Industrial Revolution from its outset. The children of the poor were expected to help toward the family budget after working long hours in dangerous jobs for low wages. Adult boys were employed by the chimney sweeps. Small children were employed to scramble under machinery to retrieve cotton bobbins, and children were also employed to work in coal mines, crawling through tunnels to narrow and low for adults. Children also worked as errand boys, crossing sweepers, shoe blacks, and sold matches, flowers, and other cheap goods.
The British Empire comprised the dominions, colonies, protectorates, mandates, and other territories that were ruled or administered by the United Kingdom and its predecessor states. It originated with the overseas possessions and trading posts established by England during the late 16th and the 18th century. British colonialism was the largest empire in history, and for over one century was the foremost global power. As a result, its political, legal, linguistic, and cultural legacy is widespread. The phrase "the empire on which the sun never sets" is usually used to describe how the British colonialism, how the British Empire expanded all around the globe, and what was this real expansion all around the globe.
The independence of the 13 colonies in North America in 1783, after the American War of Independence, resulted in Britain losing some of its oldest and most populous colonies. British attention soon turned toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. In the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution began to transform Britain. so that by the time of the Great Exhibition in 1851, the country was described as the workshop of the world. The British Empire expanded to include most of India, large part of Africa, and many other territories throughout the world, alongside the formal control that Britain exerted over its colonies, its domination of much of the world. Trade made that it effectively controlled the economies of many regions, such as Asia and Latin America.
During British colonialism, the Britain's population increased at a dramatic rate, accompanied by a rapid urbanization which caused essential social and economic stresses. To seek new markets and sources of raw materials, the British government under Benjamin Disraeli initiated a period of imperialism expansion. During these years, they expanded all around different countries and regions such as Egypt, South Africa, and elsewhere.
The Royal African Company was inaugurated, receiving from King Charles a monopoly of the trade to supply slaves to the British colonies of the Caribbean. From the outset, slavery was the basis of the empire in the West Indies. Until the abolition of its slave trade in 1887, Britain was responsible for the transportation of 3.5 million African slaves to the Americas, a third of all slaves transported across the Atlantic.
By the start of the 20th century, the United States and Germany had begun to challenge the British Empire-led. Subsequent military and economic tensions between Germany and Britain were major causes for the initiation of World War I, during which Britain heavily relied upon its empire. The conflict placed enormous strain on the financial, military, and economic manpower resources of Britain. Although, after this conflict, Britain achieved its largest territorial extent after World War I, but British colonialism, British Empire was no longer the power, was no longer the most powerful. Colonialism was no longer the most powerful empire in the world.
Decades and in so many centuries of British rule and immigration have left their mark on the independent nation that arose from the British Empire. The empire established the use of English in regions around the world. Today, it is the primary language of up to 460 million people, and it's spoken by about 1.5 billion as a first, second, or foreign language.